In this video, I'm going to talk about the text for this class. First, we're going to talk about the 4 required texts that you should acquire. Then we're going to talk about the commentaries, of which you will be asked to acquire 1 option. And then I'm going to talk about some of the optional books. These are books that are optional or something like a book report. And the purpose of this is so that you know what to expect with respect to the required text. And then you have some idea of what might interest you and what to acquire in advance of the class with respect to the commentaries and with respect to the optional. So as to our required text, the first one is The Elements of Biblical Exegesis by Dr. Michael J. Gorman. This will serve as sort of our guide for learning how to do exegesis and practicing doing exegesis. It is not specifically focused on Romans, but what we will do is take the concepts, ideas about exegesis from that book and then apply them to the letter to the Romans. The second required book is The Amnesty of Grace, Justification by Faith from a Latin American Perspective by Dr. Elsa Tamez. This book, again, is not specifically devoted to Romans. It is specifically devoted to the Apostle Paul and to the idea of justification by faith, which shows up a little bit in the letter to the Romans. And what Dr. Tamez does is she takes a very different sort of non-American, non-North American, sort of non-Western perspective on the language of justification by faith. The chapter specifically devoted to Romans, but she argues that we should think about justification in different terms, in sort of more liberative terms, sort of as a liberation theologian and as a liberation biblical scholar. She's going to argue that the best translation of the justification type words is actually liberation. Makes us think about Paul's justification language in really different ways than sort of individualized justification that we are maybe accustomed to thinking of as Protestant Christians. The next required book is Romans for Normal People by Dr. Daniel Kirk. This is a book in a series, The Bible for Normal People, that is meant to make sort of specific books of the Bible accessible to people who are not experts, people who are not seminarians like yourself. So that book is going to serve as a good baseline for us of sort of getting our bearings about the different chapters of Romans each week. So that will be sort of the book that once we get to Romans, starting in about week 4 of the class, that you go to first to get your information about the particular chapters that we will be addressing that week. It's a really accessible book. It's a really well written and a very funny book. And it's the kind of book that you might be able to take and use to do a Bible study in your own ministry setting. So it has sort of a dual purpose, not only getting our own bearings about the chapters of Romans for the class, but also to introduce you to a series that you might utilize later on. And lastly, with respect to required books, is a commentary. So we will have one shared commentary that both Greek exegesis and you all as English exegesis are reading, so that we're sort of all on the same page. This is Frank J. Matera's Romans commentary in the Paideia series. The Paideia series is the series that I require for all exegesis classes. So no matter what the book is, the shared commentary is always from the Paideia series because it is a really nice balance. It engages the Greek a little bit, but not in such a way that you as English exegesis students will be sort of left out to dry. It's explained well, but it does get into the nitty-gritty a little bit, which I think can be really, really helpful. It's also well balanced sort of theologically and ideologically. It doesn't fall too far to the left or to the right. Sort of just a good introductory commentary. So this series is one of the first commentaries that I will go to in my own study to sort of get the basic information about a particular chapter. And then from there, I'll go to some of the larger, thicker commentary, some of which I'm going to show you here in just a second. So, or just right now. So all of the English exegesis commentaries that I'm about to show you, none of these presume a knowledge of Greek. That is to say, they're not going to engage the Greek very deeply. Usually they're not even going to even present things in Greek letters. So that being the case, they are well suited for you as English exegesis. But if you want to have something that is a little bit more nitty-gritty, for whatever reason, you want to sort of stretch yourself, you're thinking about taking Greek in the future, or perhaps you have already taken Greek and are circling back to the English Exegesis version of this course, you are more than welcome to choose a text from the Greek Exegesis commentary list. We're not bound to these English exegesis, but these are the ones that are not going to presume a Greek. The first one is Paul J. Achtemeier, sort of a giant in the field of biblical studies and New Testament studies in particular. In the interpretation series, this series, as you can see on here, a Bible commentary for teaching and preaching. So it's very specifically meant to be applicable to preaching and teaching situations. You can also see the sort of length of it, not a very thick commentary. For the better or for the worse. So it's going to give you some good information about the different chunks of Romans. It divides it out by sections, but it's not going to go incredibly in depth. So if you're looking for something in depth, that's not necessarily the resource for you, but it is going to give you some sort of, going to be a little bit more practical with respect to looking towards teaching and preaching the text of Romans. The next one is the Story of God Bible Commentary by Dr. Michael Bird. Stick here. This one tends to be pretty overtly theological and a touch more conservative than many other commentaries. It's published by Zondervan, but it sort of is looking towards a ministry context, and it's sort of explicitly interpreting Romans in a way to sort of construct theology from it. Theology oriented. The next one is in the Sacra Pagina series. This one by Father Dr. Brendan Byrne, who's a Jesuit priest. The Sacra Pagina series is explicitly a Roman Catholic Bible commentary series. So it's written by people who are Roman Catholic, whether they are priests or not, or in some cases. But so it tries to sort of address Roman Catholic concerns, but oftentimes because it's so focused on the biblical text, it doesn't necessarily feel too overtly Roman Catholic. So this is one sort of, if you have maybe little experience with Roman Catholicism, that it might be a helpful introduction to you, to someone who is thinking expressly from that context. Encourage you to do is choose a commentary that maybe doesn't necessarily align with your own perspective. The next one is sort of hot off the press by Dr. Michael J. Gorman, whose name should be familiar with the very first book I introduced, The Elements of Biblical Exegesis. This is a theological and pastoral commentary. So like the Story of God commentary, is expressly theological and is about sort of doing pastoral work, not necessarily just preaching work, but is theological and pastoral in nature. I have not read this commentary yet because it just arrived, so I can't make too many comments on it, but I can say that Dr. Michael Gorman is just a fantastic person, and so I'm sure the commentary is fantastic as well. Excuse me. All right, next one we have is Robert Jewett's A Short Commentary. So there is another commentary by Dr. Jewett that is not on the English exegesis list, but is on the Greek exegesis list, and it's sort of the most highfalutin, the most scholarly of all the commentaries on the list, and it's about maybe 4 or 5 times as thick as this one. So this one is a condensed version of that much longer commentary, and it's also sort of condensed and also meant to be engage the nitty-gritty of the Greek a little bit less, more accessible to those who do not know biblical Greek. Next one is in the Abington New Testament Commentary series by Leander Keck. So this one, Leander Keck, in the sort of 80s and early 90s, was one of the most important New Testament scholars. The Abington Commentary series tends to be focused towards sort of teaching and preaching. The layout of that commentary is to not engage sort of the individual pieces, the individual words and phrases of Romans, but to deal with it in larger chunks. So it'll half a chapter or so, and then I have a few pages of sort of more like narrative commentary rather than commenting on specific things. So if you don't necessarily style yourself as type A, as sort of getting into the details of things, this might be This one is the only commentary on this list written by a woman, because it is the only commentary on Romans written by a woman that I know of. Romans commentary writing is a genre that is largely dominated by white males. That's changing a little bit. There's going to be another Beverly Gavinta, who we'll talk about in a little bit here. She is finishing a commentary now that will be out the next time this class is taught, but is not yet. But all that to say, this is the only commentary on the list written by a woman, Reverend Dr. Sarah Heener Lancaster. This series, the Belief Commentary series, is expressly not written by biblical scholars. So what this commentary series does is it takes theologians and asks the theologians to write a commentary on the biblical. So it doesn't tend to be as sort of engaged with the history and the language as some other commentaries might, and it is expressly concerned with theological. Dr. Lancaster teaches at Methodist Seminary in Ohio, so that is sort of her the way she comes at it. She comes at Romans with overtly theological questions. And the last one is the NIV application commentary by Dr. Douglas J. Moo. This one tends to be as a product of the NIV application commentary series, which is published by Zondervan, tends to be fairly conservative in its outlook, and it is largely sort of evangelical, sort of asking questions and addressing issues when it does apply things that are largely relevant to evangelical circles. So those are all the commentaries. My encouragement to you as you choose a commentary is not necessarily to choose a commentary that you think best aligns with your own outlook and interests, but maybe to choose a commentary that does not best align with your outlook and interests in order to expand your horizons. We have a tendency to sort of choose to engage the things that we agree with, and it might behoove you to choose to read something that you do not agree with this particular. All right, so the last thing we're going to do here is talk about some of the optional books. These are, they are truly optional insofar as part of the grade requirements. You may or may not complete a book report on one or two of these books, but I want to give you a sense of what is out there so that you can get an idea of whether or not you want to acquire them, read them, and do a book report on them as part of your work for this class. So I'm going to divide these up into sort of three different sections as to the kind of thing that the book addresses, sort of the thematic nature of the books. So we're going to start with 4 books that are sort of read Romans as a whole with respect to particular questions that are questions largely sort of in the world of the text. They're questions about how to best read Romans or how to read a particular topic. The first one is Scott McKnight's Reading Romans Backwards, as a sort of very historical work, wants to situate the letter to the Romans in its historical context, the issue that is being addressed. And as its name suggests, it reads Romans backwards. It starts with the end of Romans and says what happens in chapter 16. The names mentioned there are going to best inform our reading of Romans. This, the last time I taught Romans, this was one of the required shared texts. So I certainly can recommend it and say that it is a very good book and particularly interested in issues of history. Then we have When in Romans by Beverly Gavinta, an invitation to linger with the gospel according to Paul. So this is sort of just an overview of Romans, not too thick, by Dr. Gavinta, who is finishing up now a commentary on Romans and who is giant in Pauline scholarship. So this is a good sort of summary overview book. Indebted Love by Manya Stubbs. This is another book that was previously required for this class. Dr. Stubbs is a woman of color, and she particularly approaches the language of subjection. Uses the subjection language, being subject to the ruling authorities, this thing, and looks at that language in particular. And it tends to be fairly somewhat historical in nature, but also does sort of engage some sort of modern concerns as well. It's also fairly technical, so it's a bit of a heady read. But again, it was required the last time this class was taught, so it comes highly recommended. And then the last one is Dr. Catherine Grebe's The Story of Romans, and it particularly reads Romans sort of as a narrative, tracing Paul's argument and how it relates sort of in narrative form. So what sort of Paul thinks about story-wise, the story of Jesus, and how that comes out in the book of Romans. So all of those are sort of overview sorts of books. They approach particular questions, words, or themes in Romans. The next set of books I'm going to show you are different approaches to Paul, or concerned with different approaches to Paul. Either championing their own approach or sort of overviewing various approaches to Paul. We're going to fly through these ones a little bit faster. This one is Stephen Westerholm's Perspectives Old and New on Paul, the Lutheran Paul and his critics. Dr. Westerholm is sort of a defender of the traditional or Lutheran or old perspective on Paul. A nice thick book here. There's not a lot of sort of scholarship these days that is sort of expressly about defending the Lutheran perspective on Paul. So this is one that does exactly that. This one is edited by Dr. Mike Bird. It is 4 views on the Apostle Paul, and it's going to sort of take those different perspectives on Paul. One's going to be a more sort of traditionalist Lutheran perspective. One is a Catholic perspective. One is an apocalyptic perspective, and one's the sort of more radical new perspective on Paul, and sort of overview each one. So each author sort of overviews the approach, and the different authors respond to that approach from their own approach. So this is a series that Zondervan does, approaches to XYZ question, and have the sort of authors engage with one. So there's a good sort of dialogue nature to this particular. This is Marcus Zetterholm's approaches to Paul, a student's guide to recent scholarship. So this is really sort of looking at the most recent scholarship on Paul and presenting it in a way that is meant to be accessible and understandable to seminary students. Joseph Marshall's Studying Paul's Letters does something similar. It is expressly concerned with contemporary perspectives and methods that tend to be sort of progressive in their outlooks. Sort of a overview of progressive methods on Paul. And lastly is Dr. Gar Anderson's Paul's New Perspective. Dr. Anderson is sort of engaging the new perspective and constructing what he understands to be the best way to understand Paul within the new perspective, while also pulling some of the sort of more traditional Lutheran perspectives tenets into his own work. And our last grouping of optional books here. These are going to be books that are sort of expressly concerned with particular singular issues with respect to the Apostle Paul. They're sort of engaged ways of doing exegesis, thinking about a particular topic or concern. The first one, again, hot off the presses, is Matthew Thiessen's A Jewish Paul, the Messiah's Herald to the Gentiles. So Matthew Thiessen would place himself sort of in the radical new perspective on Paul camp. But what Dr. Thiessen does a really good job of is sort of bringing in the other perspectives. He is not going to sort of throw out all of the tenets of all of the other perspectives on Paul, but he does in this book is really interested in sort of situating Paul as a first century Jew with first century Jewish concerns. So if you're sort of interested in the radical new perspective on Paul, thinking about Paul as a Jewish thinker, this is a really fantastic and really accessible book. It's not meant in a for experts in the Paul the Progressive by Dr. Eric Smith is a book that sort of attempts to recover Paul as helpful for those who style themselves as ideologically progressive. Smith does. As some of the things that Paul writes and says makes him maybe less than amenable to what would be some sort of concerns. So Dr. Smith is going to want to sort of recover Paul for ideologically and theologically progressive. Excuse me. Dr. Carla Swafford Works' book is called The Least of These, Paul and the Marginalized, and sort of issue that she is addressing is how Pauline letters can speak to oppression and marginalization in the ancient world and the last one is again Dr. Beverly Roberts Gavinta, Our Mother, Saint Paul. This is not quite a full-fledged sort of feminist commentary on Paul, but Dr. Gavinta is sort of engaging with feminist concerns in this particular book, and particularly the motherly language that Paul uses, and understanding why and how and the purpose for which Paul uses motherly language. All right, those are all the books. We've got our required books, our commentaries, and our optional books. If you have questions about any of them, feel free to email them to me or put them up in the week 1 questions and curiosities